78 and the nays are 151. The bill is passed.
H.R. 308, 83 yeas, 15 nays. The bill has passed.
Welcome to Real Talk. I'm your host, Young Kim. A historic new chapter in the U.S.-Korea relations was opened on October 12 when the United States Congress ratified KORUS, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And the next day, President Lee Myung-bak spoke before the joint meeting of Congress. This provided a new opportunity to strengthen the U.S.-Korea alliance, which had been previously based on military and security sector. So what kind of changes will this bring to our two countries? Today, we'll make a forecast with Congressman Royce, who serves as chairman of the U.S.-Korea Interparliamentary Exchange Group and also chairman on the Terrorism, Non-Proliferation, and Trade Subcommittee. So let's meet Congressman Royce and have some real talk.
It means 280,000 new American jobs, and frankly, it means $10 billion in new exports.
Congressman Royce, thanks for being on the program.
안녕하세요.
반갑습니다. That means it's nice to meet you. You know, I should thank you for working really hard behind the scenes to prepare for that historic moment when the United States Congress voted on the KORUS FTA. But you know what? It took more than 4 years before it was ratified, and it was first signed in 2007. So why did it take so long?
It needlessly took too long, and part of it was on the U.S. side. Part of the problem was that when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House, there was opposition by the Democrats in the House to passage of the legislation. One of the advantages now of having the Republicans in the majority of the House is that they were supportive, but we still had to wait for the President to send down the bill. And when we think about it, it was only 9 days after the President finally submitted the bill to Congress that we were able to pass it out of both the Senate and the House and get it back to his desk.
And that was unprecedented, right?
We had never moved trade legislation in 9 days before. So we actually moved quickly once we got the legislation from the White House. I guess it was not that surprising that it would take a while because President Obama campaigned against the free trade agreement. And of course in the United States you have opposition from the unions to liberalize trade. And there was some of this also in Korea. I made several trips to Seoul to talk with National Assembly members. But the one thing that economists tell us, whether they're liberal economists or conservative economists or centrists, they all tell us the one way you create more economic activity is these free trade agreements actually create a synergy. They create more jobs. They're a win-win. And this was the argument that prevailed on the House floor and how we passed the legislation.
Let me ask you, first of all, since you worked so hard for the last 4.5 years or so to get it passed, so you must feel really ecstatic, you must feel happy.
I do. I am relieved. I must say not all the work is done, but this part is done here in the United States. There are some technical procedures that still remain for the South Koreans to undertake. But there's government support for all of that in South Korea. So I know that will happen. Yes, I am very relieved. And I was still somewhat nervous, despite the fact that as a co-author of this legislation, I was checking in with all my colleagues to make sure how they would vote. Still somewhat nervous that there might have been a problem in the Senate or on the House floor, and yet we were able to get substantive, real strength in the voting bloc in the Senate as well as the House.
And as you noted, President Obama, as a candidate, he voted or he strongly opposed it. So what made him change his mind and come to full circle in supporting it?
I think one of the factors was the fact that Europe had a similar agreement. Europe and Korea had worked out a trade arrangement based largely on the same format as KORUS. They moved more quickly than the United States. And so in July, that had gone into effect in Europe. We could already see the impact. because trade was increasing between Europe and Korea, and more jobs were being created in both countries as a result. As a matter of fact, exports out of Europe went up 36% in a very short period of time, a little over a month, into South Korea. And likewise, South Korean exports were increasing into the European market. I think the administration saw that and assumed that we were flat. We weren't increasing market share. And this was an opportunity to create that same kind of synergism between the United States and South Korea. I think that helped us in getting this agreement through.
So how will the U.S. benefit from the passage of course?
Basically jobs, because as you increase trade, and especially for us in California on the Pacific Rim here, but for all over the United States, when you consider there's about 280,000 jobs that are anticipated to be created. There will be $11 billion in new economic activity as we export into the market in Korea and as South Korea exports into our market. So jobs will be created, as economists tell us, in both countries, and this will create more economic growth and more opportunities, and regardless of the sector of employment, but manufacturing in particular. If you think about the tariffs that existed, we had 8% manufacturing tariffs on the Korean side. We
in
had
the automobile sector.
And automobile sector, we had 2.5% tariffs here. So as those tariffs come down, it makes it easier for trade and, of course, easier for investment.
And that's exactly the two of the most, I mean, there were a lot of industries that will benefit from the removal of tariff, but from the Korean perspective, they're looking at the automobile and textile industry as benefiting the most from this. But do you know what specific changes will occur?
Well, it also benefits our automobile industry as well, because there is a growing market for U.S. automobiles in Korea, and we faced a 10% tariff, I believe it was, something in that range. And so as that tariff comes down, and there was a 2.5% tariff here on the U.S. side to Korean automobiles coming in, as those are reduced, it makes it easier. So you're right, automobiles, textiles, but from the U.S. perspective also, besides computers and electronics, which right now we have a pretty hefty commercial activity in this area with South Korea. As those tariffs are dropped, we'll see more exports out of the U.S.
And you know, some say that this is more of a political and diplomatic achievement, and not too many jobs will be created. What do you say to those critics?
There is a political element to it, but there also is the very real economic reality to it, which, as I cited earlier, Europe is already experiencing the increased trade, and we will have that same impact, and that does create jobs, yes. But there is also the political reality that one of our closest relationships historically has been with South Korea. And South Korea and the United States has worked a long time to get this agreement done. Now, we know how increasingly difficult it has been to get trade agreements through in the United States. But watching as Asia has developed 180 different trade agreements.
And U.S. only has what?
We were party to two, now we'll be party to three of these. And so we've watched the increase in trade that's going on in Asia. It's important that we have access to markets there, that we bring down those higher tariffs so that we can export more into those markets as well.
Real talk. Let's talk a little bit more about the oppositions and the claims the opposing side have made, because right now the job is now, or the ball is in South Korea's court now to ratify it in their National Assembly. But before this was ratified on the U.S. side, there were so many oppositions coming out of it. You mentioned the labor union being probably one of the priority sectors that opposed it. But what other claims did you hear in the U.S. that were the key?
You run into people who make the argument that we can just trade with ourselves in the United States, and that this whole idea of reducing trade barriers and exporting is not beneficial to economic growth. I don't know any economists today who believe that. And part of it is because the great lesson through the Great Depression was that all of these countries had erected at that time very, very high barriers to trade. And the theory was, that we're going to wall off any imports coming into our country. It hurt all of the countries that were doing that. The Smoot-Hawley legislation here, back at that period of time, helped really compound the Great Depression. Right. At this point in time, we now realize that, for economic activity to occur, half of our growth in sales is caused by exports overseas. So if we can cooperate to get a fair deal, which is what this agreement was about, a level playing field, it will be a benefit to those in Korea and to the United States. And that's what I would say to the critics. We already see what's happened in Europe when we're not part of the trading agreement with Korea. Now that we will join Europe with a similar agreement, we will also see the benefits that the European companies and workers have seen recently.
And what are some of the claims you're hearing from your counterparts at the National Assembly? Right after the United States Congress ratified it, you're seeing more vocal critics coming out of Korea.
But
They're
that's
saying,
politics,
this can't happen.
But we saw that here, too, with some of organized labor prior to the passage. Now that the ball is back in the other court, we expect some of the organized labor spokesmen to come out against it. But I think the facts show that this is going to be beneficial to the economy in Korea and to the economy in the United States. And that's, public opinion is also in Korea, from what I've seen in my trips there, supportive of continued liberalization of trade, because Korea has done very well through a policy of engaging in trade with the world.
And you have plans to continue your dialogue with your counterparts at the National Assembly, right? I mean,
I
to try to
absolutely
convince
do.
them?
Absolutely, and I think that for the most part they're convinced. So I will continue in that capacity.
Sure. And you're currently serving as chairman of the U.S.-Korea Interparliamentary Exchange Group.
Right.
And I think in that capacity you've traveled to South Korea many, many times, haven't you?
I have, and not only have we covered this issue, but security issues and humanitarian issues across the board. It's a relationship that's really matured over the last, I'd say, decade especially. And you could see that in terms of the President's address to Congress, the way he was received here, the way that the President received President Lee Myung-bak.
President Lee, our two nations have stood together for more than 60 years. Over the past 2 years, we've deepened our cooperation. And with our landmark trade agreement, we will bring our nations even closer, creating new jobs for both our people and preserving our edge as two of the most dynamic economies in the world. Kashi Kapshida. We go together.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting Lee Myung-bak, President of the Republic of Korea.
그들의 땀과 눈물, 피나는 노력 덕분에 오늘날 대한민국은 가장 가난한 나라에서 가장 역동적으로 발전하는 나라가 되었습니다.
Real talk. When President Lee Myung-bak came to Washington, he received such a tremendous reception, not only by the White House, but by the United States Congress, and I think you played a key role in ensuring that President Lee does speak before joint sessions of Congress. So can you take us back through the steps until that happened?
I was happy to make that request to the Speaker of the House as a member of the Asia Subcommittee and as Chairman of the Interparliamentary Exchange with Korea. I was delighted not only in the speech itself, which I think was powerful, but also in the reception given to the President afterwards in meeting with the president, in the speaker's office. I think it was a good exchange of ideas between the members of the Congress and the executive branch from Korea. But also, I think it was unique in terms of the way he was received in the White House. I think there was an effort to make President Lee feel very comfortable.
Well, let's talk about that. We have some photos I want to show you. Take a look at the first photo. This is the photo when President Lee arrived in Washington, D.C., and the meeting was held at a local Korean restaurant rather than at the White House. I think it's unprecedented, and this says a lot about our two bilateral relationships. So let me hear your feedback.
Well, I think the food is better at that Korean restaurant. We've been to that Korean restaurant.
That's right.
So I think it was a nice gesture. And I also believe that it's sort of an example of the impact that Korean Americans are having in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a vibrant Korean American community there, including many good restaurants. And I think this is one of the president's favorites.
And I know you personally like Korean food too, right? So what are some of the food you like?
Well, I like Korean barbecue, but the kimchi is a little hot for me. But I do, we have a number of great Korean restaurants in Orange County and in Los Angeles. But frequently now in Virginia and in D.C., there are a number of new Korean restaurants, and you can see the impact that it's having on the cultural tastes here in the United States, because many people in every community go to Korean American restaurants today.
Well, let's look at the second photo. And this is the tank room, which is considered the heart of the Pentagon. And this is the second surprise President Obama gave to President Lee. What is the significance of inviting President Lee to that tank room?
Well, this is sort of the inner sanctum in the Pentagon. And to my knowledge, I don't remember other heads of state, other than possibly Winston Churchill, receiving this kind of reception. I think it connotes, it sends a message in terms of the importance of the security relationship. If you think about it, it's one of our longest standing security relationships today. We have 28,500 Americans, in Korea as part of a deterrent force serving there. And recently we had legislation which I authored, which elevated the relationship between Korea and the United States to the equivalent of NATO.
In terms
NATO
of foreign
+3.
military sales, correct?
That is correct. And I think that the close cooperation, as President Lee said, and as President Obama said in Korean at one point, this idea of we go together, the idea of the security relationship being important for the stability in Asia. All of that message is being sent that the United States and Korea are, an inseparable partnership by the fact that the president of Korea would be, in the inner command room of our Pentagon.
What do normally the individuals that sit at that table in the Pentagon, at the heart of Pentagon, at the tank room,
The Joint Chiefs.
For Joint Chiefs, I mean, what do they normally talk about?
Well, we are talking about potential security problems that might arise and making certain that we're prepared. They don't want to be surprised. We want to be able to have a plan to deal with any crisis and wind it down in a way that creates the maximum amount of stability and handling a crisis in a way that keeps it from getting out of control. So there's a lot of planning that goes on.
Great. Well, Congressman, we have some viewers who want to ask you questions.
Sure,
so let's listen to the first question.
Do you believe that the strengthening of the U.S.-Korea relations will play a hand in overcoming the global financial crisis?
Well, let me respond to say I believe it will help. I believe it will help in the sense that it will assist in the economy in Korea and it will assist our economy here in the United States. But it is just one of many, many steps that have to be taken because the world economy is so over-leveraged. There's been so much borrowing by governments by banks, by financial institutions, that winding this down slowly in a careful way and getting back onto more responsible policies in terms of spending and reducing deficits, that's going to be just as important as the advantages we make with increased trade.
Sure. Let's listen to one more question.
Sure.
What kind of agreement was reached regarding the policy towards North Korea?
Well, in this agreement, it's a trade agreement. But in terms of discussions about North Korea, our long-term ambition is to work very closely and listen carefully to our ally in Korea, South Korea, to strategize on how we can change North Korea to get it to be less belligerent. Part of the strategy, of course, is the broadcasts that we are doing into North Korea, the radio broadcasts, which now about 27% of the high-level defectors from the civilian government or, from the military tell us they regularly listen to those broadcasts, and they tell us they are having an impact. Second, we want to cooperate with the international community so that when North Korea takes an aggressive step, there's sort of reprisal so that North Korea knows that they're going to have problems getting access to hard currency, that, like the Banco Delta Asia situation, that if they do something aggressive like counterfeiting currency or take other malicious moves towards South Korea, there'll be a response. And we're trying to work together to convince China to be part of the solution rather than to subsidize North Korea, instead to make demands on North Korea that it stop its belligerent behavior. If we can change the behavior of North Korea and get enough information in for the next generation to contemplate, perhaps we can have the kind of effect we had on East Germany or on Poland, where you begin to move the society and evolve the society.
I think President Lee already extended an invitation to President Obama to come to Seoul in, I believe, March 2012, when South Korea is hosting the next nuclear summit.
Oh, yes.
And I believe President Obama already accepted the invitation. Yes. As a chairman of the Terrorism and Non-Proliferation and Trade, would you be traveling with him at the time?
Well, I would be very interested in attending that. The issue of proliferation is a key one, and on this discussion of nuclear containment, including on the civilian side, this will be part of this ongoing discussion. This will be the second year, the second summit that will be attended in Seoul. And yes, I would be interested in being part of that, because I think there's so many steps that need to be made. So many countries now have access to this type of technology, dealing with nuclear material. And on the civilian side, and on the military side, we really must make certain that we have better controls. And that will be the subject.
Great. Well, Congressman, I want to thank you for your time today. And I think the passage of KORE's FTA, again, will be bringing a lot of synergy effects to both countries. And it's my hope that South Korea National Assembly will ratify it as early as they can. So, question for you. What is your prediction? Do you think National Assembly will ratify it?
From talking to National Assembly members about this very issue, yes. I think it will be ratified, and it'll be in full effect.
Great. Well, thank you for your time again.
Thank you, Young Kim.
Thank you. President Obama used the words, 같이 갑시다. That means, let's go together. And I sincerely hope that South Korea and the United States will move forward together and produce synergy. So that's all on today's Real Talk. I'll see you next week.